So without further ado, please join me in welcoming my good friend, Will Hitchcock.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's a delight to be back here at the Center for Presidential History and at SMU and at Dallas. I just want to congratulate Jeff and also congratulate all of you for being here, but really for founding and shaping this center. I think, Americans love history, but we need places where we can come together and study in a public setting like this. And I think this is a real tribute to what the university and what Jeff in particular have done, is to create a wonderful setting for scholars to come and share their insights on especially presidential history. Everybody is passionate about the presidency. Whatever side you're on, you really care about who's in the White House. And that's one of the things that we've got going for us as historians. So why would we not write about presidents? Why would we leave that all on the table? Everybody cares about it. So it's wonderful to see so many of you engaged in what we do for a living, in studying the past, trying to figure out what it means, what lessons we can learn from it, what we can learn from great leaders, what lessons we as a culture and as a society sometimes have forgotten and need to be periodically reminded of in this day and age. Well, I'm going to make an argument today. That's what historians do. Don't let anyone tell you that historians just tell stories. Wrong. We make arguments. That's why we keep writing about the same things. I've heard this one. No, I have a different view. I disagree. I'm going to make an argument. And the argument that I'm going to make is, between 1945 and 1961, the crucial 15 years after World War II, nobody dominated American public life more than Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the most well-liked and admired man in America in these years, and I'm going to argue, here's the key word of the talk, I'm going to argue he was the most consequential in that 1945 to 1961 period. All the Truman fans, we'll take it outside afterwards. He was important too, I confess. But Eisenhower, I think, was the most consequential. I think his presidency and his entire experience, his life experience, exemplifies that 15-year period of the post-war era. He shaped modern America in crucial ways, and today I'm going to explain why and how he did it and what the significance of it is. But before I get into that, because I have a robust three-part answer to why Eisenhower was the most consequential man of that period, I just want to slow down and reintroduce you to the man, because his life story before he got into the White House is so important to the way that he governed and the way that he saw the world. And I just want to take a few minutes to reintroduce you, reacquaint you with this really quite astonishing life story. Eisenhower was born in 1890, so that makes him the last U.S. president born in the 19th century. Something that John Kennedy made a very pointed, made use of in his 1960 campaign, in his 1961 inaugural address. The new generation born in this century, right? They were talking about Ike. He was yesterday's man. But 1890, the last president born in the 19th century. His parents then were living in a small railroad town called Denison, Texas. Yes, he is a Texan by birth anyway. And that was a town they'd come to in search of work. They were trying to get out of Abilene, and they went out to Texas. They were lit out for the territories, trying to get a start at Denison, which was a very, very tiny little railroad town at the time. And after 2 years, they came to their senses, and they went back home. They went back to Abilene, Kansas. And Abilene, Kansas is where the Eisenhower family had been established since the early 19th century. So they went back to the family in Abilene. Now Abilene, at this time, around 1900, say, they went back just after 2 years. So Ike lived in Denison only till he was 2 years old. So in every respect, in every way, he believed himself and thought of himself as the man from Abilene, which was the title of numerous campaign biographies about Ike. So Abilene, at the time, was a town of 5,000 people. It was an important railroad junction then for cattle being driven up from Southwest. They put on trains and sent to Chicago and St. Louis. He lived with 5 brothers, a house. There were 6 boys in that house. A 7th died in infancy, but there were 6 of them. I don't know how many of y'all have been to Abilene and seen the Eisenhower House, but it is not large. And Eisenhower shared a bed with a brother his entire young life until he went off to the army. It was cramped quarters. He was an indifferent student, but Ike was a popular, gregarious teenager, and he grew into a strong, talented athlete. He started in football and baseball. His passions were hunting, fishing, basically being outdoors. He was a country kid. His family was poor, and they lived in a modest, attractive, but very small house in Abilene. They lived off the paycheck that his father brought home from a dairy processing plant in Abilene. They were one work injury away from poverty. No safety net at this time. As soon as the boys were old enough, they were put to work gardening or selling vegetables. Eisenhower carried the family vegetables from the family garden right behind the house, carried them up and down the streets of Abilene in a wagon, selling them for a few extra pennies during the summers. They lived really close to poverty, but above poverty. And as Eisenhower put it in his own writings, we were poor, but we didn't know it. One of the great things about America at the time was that we didn't know it. So that's a fascinating insight to the man as he perceived himself. He knew he came from nothing, but it never occurred to him that he came from nothing. He said that we lacked for luxuries never occurred to any of us. We had a fabulous life. And his life, as I would summarize it just in a sentence, is hard work, simple pleasures, family, and yes, reading Scripture. They read the family Bible almost every night, gathered around the tiny living room in that house. He was raised by a family who were deeply religious. They were members of the River Brethren sect, which is an offshoot of Mennonites. Eisenhower's parents became Jehovah's Witnesses much later in their life. Pacifists. We'll get back to that. Well, Eisenhower was an ambitious boy, and he knew that the only way to get ahead in life was to get a college education. But how on earth was he going to pay for a college education without 2 nickels? Well, he had a friend who joined the Navy, went to the Naval Academy. Eisenhower figures, well, he could do that, but he'd go to the Army instead. He got into U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he joined the class of 1915. That class became known, as I'm sure many of you know, I just tell that you're buffs of this period and of this subject, the class the stars fell on. Because the class of 1915 from West Point produced no fewer than 59 general officers who would staff the rapidly expanding U.S. military establishment and waged not just the First, but the Second World War and transformed the United States into a global superpower. Just so happens he caught the wave and he rode it to stardom. The class of 1915 also produced 2 5-star generals, one of whom was Eisenhower, the other was his classmate, Omar Bradley. It was quite a class. They also had good timing, let's be honest. Eisenhower missed the First World War just barely. It irked him so. He didn't see combat. He didn't get to France. He was tapped for leadership positions, training men stateside. Didn't get to France. But he had a habit of getting noticed. I think this is something about his early career that we always want to know, who helped you? Who helped you get ahead? Someone always opens a door. Eisenhower had a lot of doors open for him. And it's not just because he was handsome and a star athlete at Army, but because he was smart, because superiors wanted Eisenhower to be on their staff because he made them look smarter. Something to remember about Ike is that he was an absolutely brilliant person, but he managed to hide a lot of that smarts. Some of his patrons, of course, include the greatest figures of the interwar and World War II military, Generals Pershing, MacArthur, and eventually General George Marshall, all pulled Ike further up the ladder. Marshall pulled Ike out of obscurity and brought him to Washington on the eve of Pearl Harbor to help plan the two-front war that was going to transform America into the great superpower that it would become. In 1942, that's what Ike looked like in 1942, before the war really took a toll on him, George Marshall sent Eisenhower to London to lead the European theater of operations. Now just remember, Eisenhower had not yet and would never fire a shot in anger in battle. But George Marshall said, I want that guy running the war against Hitler. George Marshall, hands down, the architect of the victory in World War II, but also one of the great Americans of the 20th century, a man whose slide when I show, this is obviously not George Marshall, when I show him a slide to my students, even in Virginia, Many of them don't know who he is or who he was. So there's a book to be written on Marshall, more with one. But Marshall wanted Eisenhower to take that job. Why? Not because he was a warrior, not because he was a great battle commander, but because he was a diplomat. He had the skills of a diplomat, of a coalition builder. He was a logistical genius. He was an organizer. He was a talented leader. He could manage big egos, and that's, of course, what he was going to have to do. He proved himself to be an organizational genius. That's what Marshall needed. He didn't necessarily need another warrior to go attack the Germans. Eisenhower's 3 years as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, I think, they would have taxed any human being, and I think they were an enormous strain and stress trial for him. And he proved to be a man of enormous durability, determination. And I think, just very briefly, I'll just say, I think he learned a number of crucial lessons. I'm often asked, what did I learn in the war? So I wanted to shape his presidency, so I put that into the top to anticipate that question. It's a great question. And it's actually made me think a lot about the way in which war tests leaders and their relationship to politics in the future. One thing I think he learned, obviously, in the war, running the European theater operations, is the importance of cooperating with allies. Eisenhower was the great advocate of international organizations, not just NATO, of which he was the first commander, but the United Nations. One of the most ardent advocates of international diplomacy, United Nations, international bodies. He believed in them. He believed in diplomacy first. A second thing, the value of failure. You know, Ike didn't just have the Second World War victory handed to him on a plate. North Africa was a kind of mess. Eventually we went out to victory, but there were a lot of learning. There was a steep learning curve. If you read Rick Atkinson's wonderful work, you know how messy it was. Italy was a disaster. Eisenhower was almost sent home. He couldn't get through in Italy. His record looked a little spotty, so but he learning and adapting from failure. I think that's very important. The strains of command. What is it like to send young men to their deaths? Eisenhower knew what that was like, even if he hadn't fired a weapon. He knew very well what it meant to send young men to do very, very difficult and risky things, as he did on D-Day of June 6, 1944. Other more prosaic tasks, he learned how to handle the press. One of Eisenhower's great skills as president was talking without saying anything. He was so good at it that people began to think he was dumb. But we know he wasn't dumb, but we did learn in the war to cultivate the press. And boy, was he good at that. He learned how to bring those war correspondents into his confidence. And he would say, boys, and all his boys. You know, and he would tell them some nugget that had zero significance on the battlefield, but they felt that he trusted them. They really did love Eisenhower, and he had, on the whole, he had very good press. Of course, he also learned how to handle the big egos. I don't need to go into the history of the Second World War with you. Here are a few of the biggest: Montgomery and Allenbrook, Patton and Bradley, who fought with each other and also fought with him. But of course, a president has to manage a team of rivals, a cabinet, whatever it may be. And Eisenhower had figured out how to do that in the war. And the last lesson, ladies and gentlemen, I think he learned from the war, and I say this because he said it, he learned to hate war. He learned to hate war. And I'll just give you the sentence that he said in a speech that in June of 1945 when he was coming home and everyone was saying, Ike, thank you for winning the Second World War, you're so terrific. And he said, there is no greater pacifist than the regular army officer. He doesn't want war. He never wants it. This is June of 1945, ladies and gentlemen, the moment. I mean, what do you think Patton's? How do you think he would have handled that situation? Ike was saying, I don't want ever to go to war, and I don't want to see all those boys going into war and not coming home ever again. Well, following the end of the war, Ike was asked to succeed the great General Marshall as Army Chief of Staff. This is one of my favorite photos of Ike. This is 1946, and I just think it captures one of the things that many people have forgotten about Eisenhower, which is his physical presence. This is a confident man. He's leaning up against the tree. His hat's a little at an angle. He's just defeated Hitler. He's now the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He's kicking back with the smoke. He's got that look on his face like, you want a piece of me? You have a problem? He just radiates authority and authenticity in a man who knows who he is. And that is precisely what he was by this time at the end of the war. He became Chief of Staff of the Army, and guess what? The work absolutely bored him to death, and it exhausted him. It was very difficult. He had to dismantle the great military establishment that he'd done so much to build during the war. It was agony, it was like cutting off his own arm. It was very, very difficult. So by 1947, he was ready to leave the Army, and he accepted the job of president of Columbia University. And guess what? Being president of Columbia University also bored him and exhausted him. And he found that was a bad fit for an Army officer. However, the Columbia chapter in his life was really important because he was bored at the faculty meetings and he didn't really want to deal with the boiler in the gym or raising money, but it was an opportunity that gave him a platform. It gave him a platform in New York City. And in 1948, 1949, 1950, Eisenhower discovered, I have political opinions, and I have a platform to speak them. And he became a man of ideas, and he began articulating those ideas. And he gave speech after speech after speech, literally hundreds of speeches, often 2 or 3 a week, not just in New York City, but around the country during the period between 1948 and 1951, when he really started running for president. What did he say in these speeches? Well, this is where we find out, roughly around 1949, that Eisenhower was a conservative, in many respects, a conservative Republican, in fact. His theme was freedom. Freedom versus what he called statism, the rapid and unchecked growth of the modern state. He declared in these speeches that the Soviet system was just like the Nazi system. It was about totalitarianism. It sought to consolidate power in the hands of the state, and the result was the crushing of individual spirit and human liberty. But the kicker of these speeches was, this is what's happening in America today, he would say. The New Deal and the Fair Deal have gone too far. The United States government has become too big, too unwieldy. Social Security is snuffing out individual initiative. This is remarkable stuff, especially because he didn't govern this way. But as he said, it was like he was released, and he was just shot out of a cannon. Suddenly he left his military uniform behind, and he could be political, and he loved it. And he really took on the legacy of the New Deal in a fairly sharp manner. He said the dictatorship of the state is the greatest threat Americans face. And he used that word, the dictatorship of the state at home, from an expanding government bureaucracy. Well, by 1951, with the Truman administration besieged by so many difficulties, from the Korean War to inflation to labor strikes and the Red Scare, we all love Harry Truman, but let's remember, his Americans in 1951 did not love Harry Truman, and he had some of the worst approval ratings ever in the early 50s. Many Republicans came to Eisenhower and begged him to run for president. And he pretended and said, oh, I couldn't possibly know. I don't have anything on the resume, really, except, defeating Hitler. He really, really tried to pretend he didn't want to be president. He did want to be president. He played it really beautifully. Oh, well, if you guys would draft me. Finally, he quit all of that. He said, all right, I'll do it. He agreed. 1952 election between Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson was a very bitter one, in which outgoing President Truman said unspeakably nasty things about the Republican candidate, and in which the GOP painted the Democrats as soft, basically on everything from communism to corruption in government. The outcome of that election was never in doubt. Eisenhower won a landslide. Okay, so Ike becomes president in January 1953, and he governs for 8 years. Quite tumultuous years, which I'll get into now. But what's his legacy as president? Well, the task of evaluating Ike is a kind of tricky one, and it's one that many historians have just decided that they're not interested in doing. There are certain presidents everyone wants to write about, but Eisenhower was never one of them, and it's interesting to think about why. I think Eisenhower was underestimated as a politician right from the start of his active pursuit of the presidency in 1951, all the way through his 8 years in office, and indeed for many years after he left office. The critics and the press and the Democratic Party during his presidency and after styled Eisenhower as a lightweight, he was an orthodox, pro-business, do-nothing president, a lazy leader, all that grinning and so forth. Actually, he was a very callous man, he was a mean man, etc. This is some of the stuff that you can see in the contemporary press and in the press of the 60s as well. It's a very puzzling paradox. We know Eisenhower was the most popular man in the 50s. We know he won 2 enormous landslide elections. We know his approval ratings were stratospheric. No post-war president comes within shouting distance of Eisenhower's approval number. Reagan, Clinton, they're miles behind him. What explains all this criticism while he was in office? That's a kind of a puzzle. Part of it came from Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, who sort of shaped the initial cut that Ike was dumb. Maybe Adlai Stevenson mocked Eisenhower for being tongue-tied, for not being very articulate, not having really very sharp ideas. Harry Truman piled on. Truman doubted Eisenhower could even do the job. Just after the election of 1952, Truman said something that's gone down in the books. Poor Ike, Truman said. Oh boy, it won't be a bit like the Army. No, he'll sit here and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. That's Truman's take on Ike. Like, he didn't know how to do anything, he just got other people to do it for him. Well, Americans loved Eisenhower's style, they loved his charm, they loved Mamie. I mean, as the New York Times wrote about Eisenhower, the American people had a love affair with Dwight D. Eisenhower during much of the 1950s. But the presidency didn't change very many minds among the commentators and politicians. A 1958 book by journalist Marcus Childs described Ike, and this is a great term, useful term, as a captive hero. That's even better. A captive hero, he was taken captive by the Republican elite, by big business, and he was propped up, and then words were essentially put into his mouth by hidden forces. He was a captive hero. He was a ventriloquist dummy, according to that commentator. William B. Shannon, the New York Post's Washington columnist, concluded that Ike had accomplished nothing in 8 years in office. The Eisenhower era, he wrote, was the great postponement. The great postponement. And the scholars of that era agreed. In 1962, the Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr., that's not Junior, the Kennedy official, but Arthur Schlesinger Sr., he published a famous poll. It asked 75 historians to rank the presidents. Eisenhower, in that poll, this is 1962, he ranked 22nd out of only 31. Absolutely in the bottom of the class. He was nestled right between Chester A. Arthur and Andrew Johnson, who right now is widely considered the absolute last. So he really was getting thumbs down from academics at the university. Well, nobody did as much to harm the Eisenhower reputation as the Camelot Plan. During the 1960 election, John Kennedy did not really run against Richard Nixon. He ran against Dwight Eisenhower. The Kennedy campaign used Eisenhower as a perfect foil. Kennedy was young, handsome, cool. That's the word they use all the time about Kennedy. Cool, so cool. Sharp, he was cool, but I mean, they really loved to describe Kennedy as cool. Sharp-witted, sexy, daring, dynamic. Ike, in 1960, was 70 years old. He was the survivor of a serious heart attack, a major intestinal operation, and a mild stroke. And to many people, he did appear to be a man of the previous century. And I found the two greatest contrasting photographs I could possibly find to give you a sense of just how different they appeared in the eyes of so many voters. And indeed, for years after Kennedy's tragic death, Kennedy's admirers continued to denigrate Eisenhower in order to heighten the beauty and the glory of the Kennedy era. And Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the author of that enormous paean to the Kennedy years, 1,000 Days, he described the nation capital as somnolent in the Eisenhower era. Somnolent, everyone's dozing. Nobody could be woken from their 3 martini lunches. But under Kennedy, he wrote, "Oh, the city came suddenly alive. The air had been stale and oppressive," Schlesinger wrote. "Now fresh winds were blowing." I mean, it was just as if, you couldn't imagine a duller era than the 50s, and boy, now Kennedy was president. It was all going to be great. Basically, Schlesinger said the Eisenhower presidency was a prolonged national nap between the 2 eras of wakeful democratic activity, Roosevelt and Kennedy. So by the time of his death, Eisenhower, in March of 1969, at the age of 78, Eisenhower had been largely forgotten by the press. He'd been written off as a benign figure. He was more figurehead than president, said Time magazine in the official obituary. This is the man who won the Second World War and was president for 8 years. He was more figurehead than president, said Time magazine, and out of touch with his people. Well, I beg to differ. I disagree. That's the best thing you students can say in class. I disagree, and then figure out what it is was on the reading. will love you forever. Just going to go back to this now. We know that's a caricature of Eisenhower that emerged in the 50s and the 60s, because in the last couple of decades, a lot of scholars have been writing monographs on a wide range of Eisenhower's presidency, from the Korean War through the rise of covert operations, the CIA, nuclear weapons, policy all around the world, the Third World. They've been writing books on the home front as well, and it's been a remarkable revival of Eisenhower's fortunes. I decided, well, I would put it all together in one book. So right here, between these two covers, you can have it all in this book about Eisenhower's presidency. And I take it, and I've done a lot of research as well, and I take it all to mean, the way I've summarized it again, is that Eisenhower was so consequential in the 1950s, and not just in his decade, but I believe he shaped the rest of modern America for much of the rest of the century. And I want to give you my 3 examples of how Eisenhower was consequential for mid-century America and for the decade later. And I hope you all close the windows on the way out. It'll all be gone by the time we're done, so just come back with me to the 50s. So Eisenhower, I believe, shaped America in 3 important ways. I'll discuss each one of them. The first is he built, he created and legitimated the idea of a permanent peacetime warfare state. Second, he shaped domestic politics, and especially Republican Party politics, in important ways by creating and, again, legitimating a consensus among Americans, among a wide swath of Americans, about the appropriate place of government in the lives of Americans. And third, I think he gave us a model for the presidency itself that I'll discuss very briefly at the end. So warfare state, Republican and domestic politics, and the presidency itself. First, the warfare state. Eisenhower dramatically expanded the scale and the scope of the 20th century warfare state. He didn't do it all by himself, obviously. He built on decisions that were made in the Truman presidency. But between 53 and 61, Eisenhower crafted and placed in the minds of Americans the importance of keeping a permanent peacetime warfare state, designed to be technologically cutting edge, global, capable of serving the nation's security needs at a moment's notice anywhere in the world. That warfare state that Eisenhower built dwarfed anything Truman had ever envisioned. Yes, Truman dramatically increased military spending when the Korean War broke out, but before that, his administration was busily dismantling the U.S. armed forces and cutting U.S. military capabilities. Not so with Eisenhower. He was determined to maintain a permanent peacetime military establishment that would never be caught unawares, never be surprised, never be ambushed. And the numbers tell a story. Not that I'll give you many numbers, but I'll give you one that I think you can remember, and it's a surprise. In the Eisenhower years, the United States spent about 10% of GDP, 10% of GDP each year on the military establishment. A higher percentage than any peacetime administration ever, before or since. Far higher. And I say peacetime because after the June of 1953, the Korean War was over. So where was all those dollars going? Today, we spend about 3% of GDP, 3.3% of GDP, of course, much larger economy. Nonetheless, the man who warned later generations about the military-industrial complex did a great deal to build it. And that's a paradox, and I will happily explain that in a minute. He also developed a rhetorical strategy to explain why this was important, to explain why he was doing it. Right from the start of his presidency, he embraced the idea that America faced an existential threat from communism and from the Soviet bloc. He drew on the language of the Red Scare to denounce the communists the world over as insidious, secretive, tyrannical, immoral, subversive. In his first inaugural address, he said this: "Forces of good and evil are massed and armed and opposed as rarely before in history." I mean, the Cold War was scary, but just remember, you just come back from defeating the Nazis. I mean, there was a recent example of good and evil, etc. But nonetheless, that's the Cold War for you. They remember the Second World War, but the shape of the Cold War looked terribly dangerous to them indeed. Freedom, he said, is pitted against slavery. That's a word that was used a great deal in the 1950s to describe this bloc. Slavery, the enslavement of Eastern Europe. It said lightness is pitted against the dark. So I just want to stress that right when he came into office, the idea of a golf-playing affable Ike, totally phony. In fact, what he said is, we live in an, quote, age of peril, a phrase he used again and again and again. And then he said this to the public. You live in an age of peril. Beware. Be on guard. Pay your taxes and help me build the military-industrial complex. Now, these views did not lead Eisenhower to recklessly into war. On the contrary. In certain respects, the keynote of the Eisenhower national security policy was restraint. After all, it was Eisenhower who ended active hostilities in Korea in 1953. He avoided military intervention in Indochina in 1954. He deterred China's military adventures in the Taiwan Straits in 1955 and again in 1958. He compelled Britain and France to get out of that crazy invasion of Egypt and the Suez Canal in 1956. He avoided a conflict over Berlin in 1958, and he even established good relations with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Any one of these crises could have led to war, and Eisenhower managed them brilliantly to avoid that fate. But he was no dove. He was no pacifist. And his global strategy required the steady accumulation of immense amounts of power, most importantly, a willingness to use it if necessary. The U.S. nuclear arsenal soared in the 1950s, from a few hundred weapons to well over 20,000 warheads that could be delivered on a number of different platforms around the world, from the long-range B-52 bombers to the increasingly powerful Atlas and then Titan ICBMs to the undersea Polaris missile. By the time Ike left office, here's a jaw-dropping number, the United States had detailed plans for launching 3,200 nuclear weapons at over 1,000 targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe in the event of a nuclear war. That's by 1960, Ike could have said, pushed a button, and there goes Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. We had the capabilities, the targeting, the resources, and Eisenhower presided over the whole thing, and believe me, he did preside over it. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did this in the interests of peace. Eisenhower turned the United States into a military colossus of a scale and lethality never before seen on Earth. And it had a knock-on effect all across the country because it dramatically shaped the economy as well as universities and science that boosted and supported this effort, this militarization. Further, Eisenhower presided over a significant expansion of America's secret intelligence agencies and ordered them to conduct covert operations and coups d'etat around the world. Under Eisenhower, the CIA developed a global strategy that used American money, arms, and technology to undermine governments that Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles believed were threats to American national security. You can judge if they were right or not, but I'm telling you, they spent a great deal of time channeling money either to some of these people or to some of these people's enemies to try to get rid of it. All across the world, especially in the emerging third world. In Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954, two government coups were undertaken by the United States. Enormous amounts of investment were sent to South Vietnam during this period to back up noted Diem as well. The upper right. Rebels in Indonesia were funded. Covert operations in Congo and Cuba unfolded in this period, among others. So Eisenhower started a practice that has become an American habit, the delegation by the American president and Congress of a large amount of authority and responsibility to conduct a wide range of covert operations to destabilize unfriendly governments. Now, again, I'm not making a political point. I'm simply recognizing that Eisenhower took covert operations very seriously, and he used them to advance American national interests. Most scholars now believe that they overreacted with respect to many of these third world nationalists and Marxists, but nonetheless, he did it, and he was by no means sorry that he did so. So there's no doubt that, at least in this area, Eisenhower had a dramatic effect on the shape of mid-century America by channeling money into the defense establishment, by building it out, doing it in the interests of peace, mind you, deterring small wars and not invading countries using covert operations where necessary. That was his grand strategy, and it was one, I would argue, that in many respects, with some very significant departures, Americans pursued throughout the Cold War period and may indeed have contributed to the American victory in the long run in the Cold War. Well, the second area that I want to touch on, back to this lovely picture of Ike, which I absolutely love. The second area I want to touch on is Eisenhower's impact on politics in the U.S. Here, too, I think he's far more important than we have tended to give him credit for. Ike, his impact on domestic affairs. I think he created a national consensus in the 50s that lasted for some period of time about the place of government in the lives of American citizens. You know, before Ike, the pendulum swung back and forth. We had the far right, or arch-conservative views of the Hoover, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, the trio of Republicans. And then the pendulum swung way over to the very activist idea of government from Franklin Roosevelt. Eisenhower wanted to stop the pendulum right there. When he ran for president, he ran as a conservative. But when he governed, it turned out he was actually a moderate. He adopted centrist and pragmatic policies that reflected the preferences of most Americans at the time. He managed to disarm the right wing of his own party, especially the so-called old guard Republicans who had flocked to Senator Robert Taft, who were anti-government isolationists. He moved the GOP to the center, and he set out to make it into a moderating force in American politics. For example, Eisenhower early on made his peace with the New Deal. I'd said that he criticized the New Deal. He actually made his peace with the New Deal. He expanded Social Security to over 10 million self-employed people. Eisenhower raised the minimum wage. He founded the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He even suggested ideas, of course, as every president does, for a national health insurance system. And guess what? It went nowhere. Eisenhower invested significantly, of course, in infrastructure. He found a way to make government work without making it too big. The interstate highway system is a good example. Of course, building 40,000 miles of the interstate highway system cost billions, but most of the money came from user fees in the form of the gas tax, which we all still pay to this day, and which goes into a highway trust fund. And the only thing you can do with the highway trust fund is build more roads. Well, you have more roads, you have more cars, you use more gasoline, you raise more revenue, which you can only use to build more roads. Talk about a brilliant scheme. It's a self-perpetuating machine. But it didn't cost the federal treasury a huge amount of money. And his attitude towards taxes tells us a lot about the man and about the GOP in the 50s, at least the moderate GOP. In 1954, he faced sharp demands for tax cuts, actually earlier than that. He faced it in 1953 from Robert Taft before Taft died. Eisenhower went on national radio and he made a very elementary argument that will surprise you. He said, schools and roads, bridges, sewers, all of that costs money. And he said, the good American, I'm quoting, the good American is proud to carry his share of the national burden. So this notion that you can scold the American public and say, pay your taxes, you're lucky you're an American, we have the greatest country on earth, do your share. How dare you shirk it? I mean, obviously this is a winning strategy for presidential campaigns today. But he just said, that's what I believe. Passed the Internal Revenue Act of 1954 that lasted for 30 years in large part, which opened up some loopholes. Basically, it was not a gigantic tax cut that the Republican right wanted. But Ike was no liberal. And his handling of McCarthyism and the Red Scare is an example. Eisenhower accepted. He accepted the basic premise of the Red Hunters, that there were, in fact, communists that had bored into the foundations of the U.S. government and that needed to be rooted out. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how and why he put Richard Nixon on the ticket in 1952. Richard Nixon's accomplishments in 1952 were not terribly significant except for the fact that he was the man who had unmasked Alger Hiss. Nixon was serving on the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948. It was McCarthy's cruel methods. It was his methods, his baseless accusations, his destruction of personal reputation that Eisenhower hated, and he loathed McCarthy. But the idea of doing security protocols in government, hunting down possible subversion, Eisenhower thought that was the right thing to do, and indeed he said it publicly. And he joined in efforts to increase loyalty tests in the government. He, in fact, I think, wanted to steal McCarthy's thunder in some respect in the anti-communist crusade. What about the one great social, pressing, moral issue of his time, the civil rights movement? Towards the civil rights movement of the 1950s, Eisenhower responded, as many white Americans did in the 1950s, with caution, with wariness, even with anxiety. Of course, white Americans in the South responded with profound alarm. I don't think it's possible to paint a picture of Eisenhower as an unsung hero of the civil rights movement, as some recent books have tried to do. I think they've tried to make the case a little too aggressive. However, Eisenhower did make a number of really important decisions in this field that were bold, that were humane, that were consequential, and that were politically risky, and that he did not have to make. That's the key thing. He didn't have to do these things, and he did. And I'll tell you what they were. One thing is he accepted guidance from somebody who knew the issues much better than he. Very important as a leader to pick smart people and make them do the work and make you look good. He appointed as Attorney General Herbert Brownell, a New York lawyer, a totally unsung figure nowadays, but was a crucial figure on civil rights in the 1950s. By the way, I had the wonderful privilege of giving a talk in New York City to a public audience. I had no idea who was in the audience. And in the Q&A, a woman stood up and asked me a question about civil rights and Ike. And I said, oh, and Brownell is so important, yada, yada. And she said, I happen to be his daughter. You know, you love those moments. And I was like, yeah, it's just a lovely moment. And then she disappeared. I was like, no, I want to get your name and read your dad's letters and so on. But no, she disappeared. So with Eisenhower and Brownell worked very much together through the courts to weaken Jim Crow segregation, which prevailed in America in the 50s. They helped lead the desegregation of the nation's capital. Eisenhower desegregated Washington, D.C. in the first few months of his presidency. He came right as well. We can do it here in Washington because we're the federal government. It had been segregated, workplaces had been segregated since Woodrow Wilson's time. In 1953, African Americans had to get off at Union Station in Washington, D.C., off the train and go into colored-only cars if they wanted to continue south. Washington, D.C. was the line which these forms of segregation were reinforced. Eisenhower put a stop to that. They appointed boy, we're going up to 2 now, 5 moderately progressive justices on the Supreme Court. I've got 5 on the Supreme Court. Most important, of course, was Earl Warren of California, the Chief Justice, pictured here in the upper left. Warren would write the famous Brown versus Gore decision, ordering the end of segregation in public education. Eisenhower knew because Brownell told him that Warren was a liberal on civil rights. This was not a surprise. Don't let people tell you that Ike hated Warren and he denounced him and all that. He knew what he was doing. Yes, they had their disagreements later on, but he knew he was progressive in civil rights. Eisenhower also got through a deeply wary Congress, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That will now be depicted in his monument, which is going to be built in Washington, D.C. shortly. And that act was a landmark, the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction. It created a Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department and gave the Attorney General limited power to intervene in the states in cases of voting rights violations. And of course, Eisenhower took an enormous risk in 1957 when he ordered federal troops to surround Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, to ensure that the court-ordered desegregation proceed in that high school, despite the hostility of Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas. Now, Eisenhower never embraced civil rights as his own personal cause. He never took a public stand on the issues in a moral sense, in a sense of it's been too long and we now must. He never placed his political capital on the line and said, I will make this my great legacy. He was very reluctant to do that. In part because Eisenhower, we must remember, was himself in part a white Southerner. He had spent so much time in a segregated United States military. Most of his close buddies from the Army were from the South. He had spent a lot of time on Southern bases, and he had many good friends in the circles who were from the South. Jimmy Burns of South Carolina kept writing and saying, we're old friends, but we're not going to talk anymore if you keep heading there on civil rights. He wanted to slow down the progress of civil rights while also making important strides. He wanted to be a moderate. He wanted to be right down the middle of the road, which is a tough place to be in American politics. But I say he did some extraordinary things in this regard, things that, after all, not altogether clear. The Democratic Party at that time deeply divided on issues of race. And you remember that Adlai Stevenson in 1952 had a running mate John Sparkman of Alabama, who was an openly pro-segregation. So the Democratic Party might not have made these same choices that Eisenhower did in the 1950s on these matters. So in my view, of course it's an incomplete record, but I think the country was lucky that Eisenhower served in this important transitional role. All right, the last point that I'll make much more briefly about Ike and his presidency is that I think he gives us a model of presidential leadership. And I'm sure you'll get where I'm going with this. In the book, I called it something that he never used this phrase, but I think he gives us a model of what we could call the disciplined presidency. Discipline was Eisenhower's lodestar. That's really who he is. He was raised in that strict, frugal family. He was trained in a career of soldiering, and he believed that discipline was the key to success. He applied discipline to his own person. Some of you will know the story about Eisenhower quitting smoking. He had a 4-pack a day habit during the war, and in 1949, his doctor said, "You got to quit smoking." He said, "Okay. What else you got?" I was done. I was just did. Just stopped smoking. I'm not a smoker myself, but I gather it's a lot harder. He kept his weight at 175 pounds. I've seen the menus that he had in the White House: black coffee, grapefruit, dry toast. He was going to stay trim, and he did. He came into Harry Truman's very disorganized and somewhat improvisational White House, and he imposed discipline on him. He established clear rules for procedure. I'll just give you an example because it's really revealing. Every Monday, he met with the leaders from the Congress. Every Wednesday, he held a press conference. What? Did I say every Wednesday? Yes, the president alone walked into the India Treaty Room in the Executive Office building, stood in front of a room like this and said, "Okay, boys," and it was all with the boys, "what do you got?" It took half an hour of questions. And he started doing this on video, on tape in 1955, which had been broadcast on TV. Eisenhower did a weekly press conference. The president was available to the media. Again, he didn't say much, but he was there. I've read most of the transcripts of those press conferences, and I can tell you he was really good at keeping his cards close to the vest. So, a weekly press conference. Thursdays he chaired the National Security Council, and Fridays he met with the cabinet. Truman didn't convene the National Security Council very often. John Kennedy said, "Hell, I don't want all those people telling me what to do. Me and Bobby are going to just figure it out ourselves." Eisenhower endowed the NSC, the National Security Council, with enormous importance, much as he did during the war with his general staff. He used the NSC to craft his policies, to work out problems together, to read documents, and we go over them together, to edit documents of strategy together. So what are we doing on Taiwan? What are we doing on Europe? What are we doing on Iraq? How's the Atlas missile program going? And if you look at those documents, what do you find? You find a president who is the master of detail, a master of his brief, who can be presented with 8 or 10 incredibly complicated issues in a 2-hour period and say, "Okay, I got that, Dulles, I want you to do that, Dulles, go do that. This paper is bad, paragraph 3C on page 26 is wrong." It's breathtaking. The guy, he's totally in command of the scene. The National Security Council met 366 times in the Eisenhower period. Eisenhower chaired those meetings, 329 of them, a 90% attendance rate at the NSC. He chaired his own National Security Council. Why did he do that? John Kennedy was like, "God, that's boring. Why would what a waste of time? Come on, sit around with all these guys working through documents. It's terrible." He scorned it. Eisenhower said it often. This is what was required, was constantly working the problem. He said, quote, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. If you haven't been planning, you can't start to work intelligently, at least." What he was saying was, when the crisis comes, and it will come, if you have a habit of mind, a disciplined, organized system, and you know who to turn to, you could go and break the glass and say, "What happens when China decides it wants to liberate Taiwan? We got a plan for that. We've been working on that for years." That's what Eisenhower was. The man who was ready for anything. I think discipline carried over into his approach to the nation. He was a champion of the free market, and Eisenhower said, "Americans will become prosperous only if you work hard, if you make sacrifices. The government is not going to do it for you. It'll clear a path for you, but you have to do it yourself." It's no accident, I believe, that Eisenhower's closest friends were self-made millionaires. Almost all of them who started, like he did, with almost nothing, and worked their way bottom up. He loved these guys because they were emblematic of the American system, as he thought he was. He didn't really think too much about the fact that he was a federal employee his whole life, but he thought that the American system was great because it could take people who worked hard, had an idea, and they could make them rich, and he loved to be around them. But he told Americans that they needed discipline to wage and win the Cold War. In his inaugural address, to his farewell address, he insisted on this notion of vigilance and steadfast purpose. That is how Americans would carry the common burden in this age of peril. So we add it all up and we see Ike and his legacy, I think, in a much different light. Looking back upon his era, we see the caricature of the 50s and the 60s as a ludicrous failure to understand the essence of Eisenhower. Yes, he dramatically expanded the warfare state and waged the global Cold War with intensity, but also with skill. And he kept that high-stakes conflict in the 50s from ballooning into outright conflict. He dragged his own isolationist party into the bright, warm sun of internationalism. And he also gave, I think, the GOP a heart transplant, advancing important social policy, making them realize that the New Deal was not as toxic as they had thought. And he managed to make the institution of the presidency itself stronger, better organized, more rigorous, more reactive to the needs of the moment. A lot of people later on said, oh, he didn't understand how to use presidential power. Look, I mean, what are his great legacies? Come on. Well, Eisenhower did not want to build an imperial presidency. He didn't want to become Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't want to become, he didn't want to transform America. He wanted to let Americans get on with business being Americans and keep the government available to help them, but by and large, to get out of the way. He wanted the presidency to be responsive and empathetic, wise, but most important, limited in its ambitions. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're all a little guilty of asking an awful lot of our presidents. They've got to be able to do everything, from every pothole in every street. That's the president's fault. Eisenhower was having none of that. That's your responsibility. Go fill it in yourself. That was Eisenhower. So he carried with him into office the values of his forebears: self-reliance, frugality, discipline, restraint, faith, and, I think, humility. And these are sometimes seen as corny virtues in our time, but I think after so many decades of excess and, dare I say, even vulgarity in the presidency, so many decades of war and conflict and hatred and violence, the unthinkable has happened. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is turning in his grave. Americans, especially, I think, Republicans who are wondering what's happened to their party, might actually once again yearn for a leader of the caliber of Dwight Eisenhower. Thank you very much.
Microphones are going to be coming around to you. If you have a question, please wait till the microphone gets to you so I can hear you and so your words can be recorded on video for posterity.
Okay. Happy to take your questions. There's a few over on this side. Yes, sir, the gray shirt there. There's a mic next to you coming your way.
Yes. What happened to our deficit under Eisenhower in terms of the percent of the budget that was funded by issuing new debt? Was it real high like it has been recently?
Eisenhower balanced 3 out of 8 budgets, and he came pretty close on the others. So what's remarkable is despite the amount of money going into defense, the overall federal budget is still relatively small on social programs and on other commitments, very different from the way it is now. So Eisenhower was still able to insist on and work hard toward a balanced budget. And 3 out of 8 is a post-war record. So again, Harry Truman, no fault of his, but the country wobbled between a period of dramatic budget cutting and then the Korean War crisis, which required a dramatic remilitarization in 1950, and he could never get control of the budget. So Eisenhower came in, the war was winding down. He said, well, we're not going to have that kind of stop-go approach anymore. I want to have controlled spending. But the defense budget was very high, much higher than it had been in the peacetime years between 45 and 50. So fascinating issue. Of course, the overall spending in the government on entitlements was much, much smaller than it is now. So in a way, it's an unfair comparison. But nonetheless, it was a budget hog, and yet also built out the military-industrial complex. Yes, sir, back there in the blue, and if you don't mind waiting for the...
We've had two men that graduated from West Point, became the highest rank in the military, became president, and served 2 terms. That was Grant and Eisenhower. Are there any, does the similarities stop there?
Well, one similarity is they both went through a long period where everyone thought they were a bad president. A good general that never belonged to the White House. I'm not a Grant scholar, but I know a few good ones. And they are full of admiration for Grant. To be president in that period was enormously difficult with Reconstruction, the challenges that were presented there. And Grant made the best effort that he could under very difficult circumstances. I think there's a great deal of character similarities to them too. So it's an interesting study, you know, how with the ways in which war shaped their presidencies. I can't really speak to Grant himself, but I do think I know how much the life of soldiering shaped Eisenhower's worldview, but also his relations to other people. So I think it's a fascinating parallel. Yeah. By the way, we also have George Washington, so he counts too. I'm not getting over this. Oh, yes, ma'am. What I'd like to get at. Female.
My father-in-law was a close friend and advisor to Eisenhower, and I'm looking at his portrait, but I love, obviously the same artist did a similar portrait of him. Do you know the artist who did this?
You know, it's funny. I was afraid someone would ask me this. I do have it written down, but it is his official White House portrait, and I'm going to forget the name, but I have it available if I can get it from you. And this was painted not while he was in office, it's after he was left the White House. It might have been in the 60s. I love it. It's amazing. One of the things I'll just say why I love this, because so many photographs of the 50s of Eisenhower in black and white. And Eisenhower doesn't do very well in black and white because it makes him look 4 years older. Yeah, but you don't get the blue eyes. Everybody who met Eisenhower said, oh my God, those blue eyes just shot right through me. And they also talked about his energy. He had a very robust red complexion. He was energetic. His athleticism from his youth was very much a part of his character. Enormous, strong hands. He was very springy, very forward, leaned forward a lot. Everyone said he's the most charismatic man they'd ever met. Every head swiveled when he walked in the room. He had that magic.
I love the hands. My father-in-law's portrait is the same way the hands are.
Very expressive. Tell me your father-in-law's name.
Ellis McCall. He was the standard role in New Jersey. It was over worldwide production of petroleum during World War II.
Oh, I see.
So obviously he was supplying the world effort, but then they played golf together and were friends for a lifetime.
You know, Eisenhower was very close to, he had many friends in the oil industry. And again, I mean, he felt these were people who were at the heartbeat of the American economy.
And he was also very involved in the UN and a lot of other.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, is there a student? Are you a student? Yes.
Yes, I was going to ask, could you talk a little bit about Eisenhower's new look military reorganization? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there an increased emphasis on nuclear weapons, a more bang for your buck, if you will?
Yes, that's more or less as I described in the talk, is that Eisenhower was said to implement a new look, which was going to be to use nuclear deterrence rather than conventional methods. And that's been, I think, twisted to suggest that he was nuke crazy. But I think the reality is a little different. What he did was he diminished the amount of spending that went to personnel in the military because the standing army is very expensive, and he demobilized significantly the number of personnel in the armed services. And he also did build out the nuclear arsenal. The thing about the nuclear weapons is that they're not quite as expensive as having army bases filled with soldiers. So it allowed him to make America stronger without busting the budget, which was what he was keen to do. The other important piece of the new look was the use of covert operations in those areas where a nuclear deterrence wasn't going to make a difference. You weren't going to say, well, we're going to bomb Guatemala and turn it into a parking lot if they don't do what we want. You needed a different kind of tool, and that's where propaganda, covert operations, money channeled through back channels, through Nicaragua, elsewhere, would work more effectively. Now again, we can debate whether any of this was moral or correct, and I think we have a good debate about it, but the new look was a difference from Truman's policies that he felt was sustainable. A sustainable way to protect American interests against that global threat. Yes, sir. I've gotten over to that side of the room.
Can you speak more about his perception of an age of peril? Where did that come from? Did it come out of World War II or later?
The age of peril. I mean, the phrase itself was probably written by Emmett Hughes, one of his earlier speechwriters, but it captures, I think, for me, the sense of the high stakes of the 1950s. I think it's, I find it hard to remind my undergrads, I'm teaching a class on the 1950s now, nobody had any idea what the future held. They just knew what the past held. The past held that Nazi Germany had overrun Europe and had dominated the continent for, 12 years, and it was a very dangerous, miserable period, and it was a direct threat to America. And that at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had done, or it looked as if it was going to do much the same thing. It had rolled into Eastern Europe. And in 1949, they got their own atom bomb, and then China went communist. And then the Korean War began in 1950, and it looked like communism, whatever it was as a set of ideas, was a militarily aggressive system run from Moscow. And it was busy in Asia, and it was busy in Eastern Europe, and it was busy in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And guess what? They were even busy inside the State Department. Now, we think of the McCarthy era as a terribly awful time because it was so wrong-headed, so abusive, so cruel. The problem is there were a couple of communists in the government. They were minor figures, Alger Hiss, others. The ones inside the Manhattan Project were not so minor, however, so the possibilities were there that the worst case scenario was true. Soviets were on the march everywhere, now they got the Chinese with them. Not only that, there are communists inside your jam cupboard, and watch out. So Eisenhower wasn't going to be the guy who said, okay, vacation, everybody go home. Don't worry about it, no problems here. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. We live in an age of peril, and we must prepare. Even if it's peacetime forever, we must prepare for the worst. So it comes from, I think, his military background, which was you'd always want to be ready for the worst and hope for the best.
I think we have time for one more.
Oh, gosh.
President Hitchcock. Can it be said that Eisenhower was the greatest strategician, I think that's how I pronounce it, to occupy the White House, and that strategy based on military discipline, based on upbringing, strict upbringing, is something that is vanishing from the world, and is that instead what we're seeing are tactics.
I think that's an interesting question, and I wouldn't want to start a debate over which is the greatest strategist in the White House. I think he was a very effective, very good one, and I think he was, he understood what American strengths were, and those were not only military, because they were also, and this was something he placed much greater emphasis on, they were the ideas that Americans stood for. They were the ideas of freedom and democracy, which he was a fanatical believer in, which he had spent his whole life defending, and which he hoped would take root around the world if the United States could help. So the Cold War strategy that he pursued was global. It was based on a combination of military force and also aid, economic aid, and investment in international institutions to demonstrate that the American way was the best way. Now, we all are going to have arguments about whether he was effective in pursuing that, or if that's just a myth. That's what he believed. I would, however, also point out Franklin Roosevelt was also a very good strategist, one of the great grand strategists who figured out how to match limited American means at the beginning of the war to a two-front war and lead us through to victory. Of course, he had Eisenhower to help, so they share a little bit of the church. And of course, Churchill and Stalin, for that matter. So it's one of those wonderful dinner time conversations. You know, we're the great presidents who were great strategists, and I think Eisenhower belongs among their number for sure. Yeah.
So let me ask a question which is both going to affirm and then rebut everything that you just said over the last hour and a half.
In your dreams, I move.
If we grant that Eisenhower was the most consequential man of his age, that the Age of Eisenhower is actually the most apt title, something like that, everything that Eisenhower seems to have built appears to have either eroded or be eroded. For example, NATO, which is certainly under more stress now than it had before, something which of course he was present at the creation for. Transatlantic relations more broadly. The European Union, which he of course had ambivalent feelings about, but certainly recognized the necessity to decrease nationalism at its heart, having been opposed violently to nationalism, especially against the German variety. And more importantly, seeing, if you will, right-wing nationalism come back into vogue around the world, in this country in particular, and also in Europe, Eastern Europe especially. Is the Age of Eisenhower over, and what might he have done to create a more sustainable model? Or frankly, should we say, he gave us 50 years and it's on us?
Well, he has been dead since 1969, so he's not really responsible for the fate of it. But I take your point, and I think what I would conclude, I don't think we disagree at all. I think you're exactly right, that so many of the institutions that promoted American greatness in the mid-century and really through much of the 20th century have been placed in jeopardy today. Eisenhower, if he were to come back, he would say, why are you doing this to yourselves? Why would you undermine the most successful alliance in history, the NATO alliance? Why would you seek to widen the gaps in the European Union, something that was an American idea and an American project right from the very beginning? If you could get the Europeans to share an economy together, guess what? They wouldn't go to war with each other anymore. That's good for America. We can sell them more cars. We buy a lot more of their cars, but you know what I mean. So these institutions had a political purpose. They had a strategic purpose that Eisenhower believed in. And I think what it demonstrates is not so much that nothing lasts forever, but these things need to be sustained by a commitment of political leaders who say, I believe in them, and I'm going to work on behalf of them, and let me explain to you why I believe in them. When was the last time you heard a president, any president, I haven't heard, I can't recall, saying, here's why NATO is one of the most important things the United States has ever done. Of course, by the time he even gets NATO out of his mouth, people are starting to tune out. That's a shame. We must recognize the value of these pillars that American power has rested upon for 70 years. The system works really well, and we are, for some reason, choosing to mess it up. I would just say, I think Eisenhower would ask, look, we've got plenty of problems at home, we need to focus on them, but let's not mess up the stuff that's working. Let's continue to ride out these institutions as long as they can, precisely because if we don't, things like right-wing nationalism and war in Europe will reappear, because they're there. They're just waiting for an opportunity to come back out of the cracks, out of the cave. And they will come back if we lower our guard. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.